Amen. Good morning again. Already it's only presentation 2 and it feels like time starts to fly. I will review what we taught this morning. I know that these concepts are not new to many of you. As I speak to people, it's clear that people who have accepted the messages taught over the last few years have really fallen in love with this methodology of parable teaching. They've seen the power of what it can do. So really this is just a reminder, an introduction into the power of that methodology and where it comes from. It's not something unique or just new to this dispensation, but it's actually an evidence of the truth of this movement as opposed to Future for America, as opposed to Adventism and every other movement that exists. It is the signature, the methodology of parable teaching. So we went back to Acts of the Apostles 54.2, and we saw that at Pentecost she identifies in that concept that she's building the outpouring of the Holy Spirit as the former rain. And she identifies that outpouring of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost as the former rain is an understanding or an opening up of the parables that Christ had previously taught them. So if this early rain, it's the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, she says that at the end of the world, near the closing scenes, there's going to be another manifestation of divine power, symbolized by the latter rain, also described as the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. If the definition of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit in the Alpha history is an understanding of parables, then it must be the definition of it in the Omega history also an understanding of parables. We understood that at Pentecost they understood what Christ had previously taught them regarding the nature of his kingdom, and we looked through just some of his parables. Jesus isn't going through this history blindly. He knows full well that the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders have been looking for this warrior king. He knows full well that John the Baptist has preached of the arrival of a warrior king, and he knows full well that he is not that warrior king. So what he has to do is re-educate the disciples with a straight message, but also quite gently, by using this methodology of taking the true nature of the kingdom of heaven and comparing and contrasting it with all of the different stories that the disciples do understand. And we went through these, many of them in Matthew 13, our parable chapter, but also in different chapters, just dealing with the book of Matthew. The sower, the mustard seed, the leaven, the treasure, the merchantman, the net, the householder, the king, an Eastern wedding. And we spent a little bit longer on this Eastern wedding, as it's a key history, a key parable that the Millerites were required to understand. So he uses this methodology to teach the disciples about the true nature of his kingdom. He cannot pass that message on to the Pharisees. They've rejected the light. They were not benefited by the teachings of John, even with his misconceptions. So they have no possibility of benefiting by his parables here. So the parables are not for them. They're blind and they're deaf. But they are for the disciples. So we see in this history the two groups. But even within the disciples there are two groups. There's the ones who are willing to learn through the parables that he's teaching them, and then there is Judas who refuses to learn through the parables. He holds on with all of his strength to this hope of a warrior king. And just prior to the cross, when Jesus is down on his knees washing their feet, he finally realizes this is not the behavior of a warrior king. And he decides that he's going to try and bring about his idea of what that kingdom should be through his own effort. So he splits from Christ, he leaves the table, leaves the upper room, and goes about his own work. That results in his demise. we took this history and we applied it to our own, and we saw how when we come in to our time of the end in 1989, we have these misconceptions from Adventism. Those misconceptions have been taught in this Alpha beginning history by Elder Jeff Pippinger. And we understood that that was not a mistake on his part, but this was allowed by God, just as it was the misunderstandings of Miller and of John the Baptist, because it gave an impetus to the work that it would not have had. So through this history from 1989 to 9/11, God is able to use even those misconceptions to benefit the work. But then it comes into the history where we have increasing light, more increasing light. And we are required to unlearn those misconceptions, as were the disciples, as were the Millerites. The work of teaching us those parables begins under the second angel. And we know that parable teaching has been primarily introduced to this movement by Elder Parminder. He's identified the methodology we used and really given to us the rules for utilizing that method. Elder Parminder being identified as the second angel. So we were meant to unlearn them in this history. Those who did not, just like Judas, just prior to the shut door, they leave the table and they walk away. As they reject that parable methodology, I said this as soon as they left, and it has held true more and more, that as they reject, what they hope to reject is just the midnight cry message to begin with. They're going to reject this dispensation of 14 to 19 and the message of the midnight cry. But what they have had to successively do is actually start erasing this prior history. So they're now going back on things that I don't believe they ever originally thought they would have to let go of. They would never have imagined straight away in this history that they would start doing public evangelism and start really breaking down reform lines. But because they've let go of parable methodology, many of the other truths that they once taught, they can no longer justify. And we can give some examples of that later on. They still hold to one with all their strength, because it's all they've got to convince the people now that they have a message, and that is the message of time setting. That's the one they won't let go of, because that is the only message that they can give through their numerology. But if they were to be consistent in breaking down the parable methodology that they have rejected, they must also let go of time setting. In fact, they must lose all light that has increased from 9/11 itself. And in fact, they're already moving the second angel from 9/11, and we will address that later. So we see those who reject the parables just prior to the shut door, and the division of those two groups, marked by the cross or November 9 this year. Literal and spiritual application. So we then discussed how this methodology has been foundational to the Midnight Cry message. Everything that we've taught, whether it's understanding the restraint of radical Islam, or the King of the North and the King of the South, or church and state, all of these different subjects, equality, they've all been understood through this methodology. Taking what we don't know what we do know to explain what we don't. Taking World War I and World War II to explain World War III. The Diadochi Wars to explain war in our time. All these different lines or histories have been uncovered and taught based on an understanding of the rules of parable teaching. And we can be sure that as we understand light in the future, it also will be founded upon these same rules. We went to the history of the Millerites. We saw how they had an issue with understanding the nature of Christ's kingdom in 1844. They thought that the bridegroom coming to collect his bride would be the Father, Jesus coming to this earth to take his kingdom home. When in reality that was something that occurred in heaven, and they had to follow by faith the movements within the heavenly sanctuary. So they understood the nature of the kingdom. And we looked at a couple of great controversy passages for that. And while we've primarily looked at the end of ancient Israel to learn about the end of modern Israel, we see the same issue within the time period of the Millerites, where they're taking the misconceptions of Protestantism, how Miller took those, what he thought the earth was and the sanctuary and these different elements, he took those into his own message and incorporated them, and they did not unlearn those messages prior to October 22, 1844, which led to their disappointment. So we talked about that methodology, and then we gave an example of it. And what has been taught throughout from earlier in this year is how we can take this, which we call compare and contrast, comparing and contrasting two different stories built on two different lines to learn or discover information not readily available. And we gave an example of that when we were able to compare and contrast Daniel 11:40 Part A with Daniel 11:40 Part B, the time of the end of 1798 with the time of the end of 1989. And I wanted to focus in that study on the external, on the war between the King of the North and the King of the South. So if you don't mind, I will erase part of this. So when we did that, we have known for some years, for 3 years now, that the King of the South was again a subject of prophecy. We've understood that since 2016. From 1989 to 2016, that's 27 years, we had been under the belief that the King of the South was finished as a subject of Bible prophecy, that it didn't have any other job function, that it had been destroyed, defeated. So we were in this blind spot between Daniel 11:40 and Daniel 11:41, which is the Sunday law, somewhere between 1989 and the Sunday law. And in 2016, studies were presented on Daniel 11, and again, in those studies of Daniel chapter 11, again, although people may not have realized it or known it then, it's again the methodology of parable teaching, taking a literal history to explain our own or the spiritual. So when Daniel 11 was studied, the battles of Raphia and Panium in their literal application were taken to our time, and we could see that the King of the South was still a subject of prophecy. We were still living in a time period of Daniel 11 verse 40. So that was understood in 2016. What this methodology does, though, is show how that is actually a truth already built into just the structure itself. How when we line up 1798 and 1989, there's a war, a deadly wound, and a death. And I'll redraw that more neatly down here. We have 1789. This is the beginning of a war between the King of the North and the King of the South that's going to reach its point of climax in 1798. In 1798, which is the end of the 1260, you find the fulfillment of Daniel 11:40 Part A, and what is described as the deadly wound of the papacy, or also as captivity. He that leads into captivity will himself go into captivity. But there's also the second part of that verse that says that he that killed with the sword must be killed with the sword. So the papacy couldn't just receive a deadly wound, it had to die. It led into captivity, so its punishment for leading into captivity was that it itself would go into captivity. It killed with the sword, so its punishment was to be killed with the sword. It goes into captivity in 1798, but it isn't then killed. It's killed in 1799. Deadly wound and death. From 1798 to 1799, it's crumbling. And we find that prophecy marks 1798 as the premier waymark in this history. Then we understand Revelation 13 verse 3. So Revelation 13:10 was the one we turned to earlier. He that leads into captivity shall go into captivity. One waymark, the deadly wound. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Second waymark, death. Revelation 13 verse 3 takes us forward from that history. It says, and I saw one of its heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. We know that when the papacy comes back into history, it's described as a resurrection, a coming out of a pit. So if it's resurrecting or coming out of a pit, where has it been? So from here to here, it's in the grave. And then it's going to ascend and be resurrected. So there's a war, a deadly wound, a death, and then in the future a resurrection. This is Daniel 11:40 part A. When we come to Daniel 11:40 part B, we're finding many of the same concepts repeated. We have an ongoing war between the king of the north and the king of the south. This war, extending from the end of World War II, is known as the Cold War. Fought from 1945 to 1989, ending in 1989, the time of the end. Daniel 11:40, part B. Now, in 1989, we see the defeat of the King of the South, with the fall, really all the events throughout that year. We concentrate on the fall of the Berlin Wall, but there are other events in that year that show the demise of the King of the South. But in 1989, you see the Soviet Union receive a deadly wound. But is it then dead? No. The Soviet Union stumbles along until 1991, when it's finally and formally dissolved. The King of the South is not dead in 1989, but it is dead in 1991. You see this progressive fall, just as you do in this Alpha history. So from 1991, we're right to identify the King of the South as dead. But when we use the methodology of compare and contrast, what do we know? What we can be assured of is that it was not finished as a subject of prophecy. If the King of the North could go through this history and resurrect, then the King of the South must also resurrect. So without understanding Raphael and Panium and these histories, we can still identify the King of the South as being resurrected in our time, just based purely on the structure. The structure itself tells us the King of the South would resurrect. So it caused a little bit of trouble within this movement when this was not this itself, but when throughout the last 14 months when we described what the King of the South looked like and how this ongoing war would continue. So we understand Daniel 11:41 is the Sunday law. In the history of 1989, the history of 1989 takes us from Daniel 11:40 through to verse 41. So Daniel 11 verse 40 extends from 1989 through to the Sunday law. And the problem people started having is we started teaching that this war between the King of the North and the King of the South that was not finally completed in 1989, that's back with these battles of Raphia and Panium, that this war would not be a hot war between the North and the South. People had trouble with that because they expected to see this open hot war between America and the Soviet Union. And the reason that we were thinking that way was again a misunderstanding of parables. Because when we see a literal war in history, we don't bring that literally into our time. What tripped us up in understanding what this resurrection would look like was a misunderstanding of how we apply literal and symbolic. Again, a misunderstanding of parable teaching. So we understood that 1989 it comes back. After 1989 it resurrects. That there are these key battles, Raphia and Panium. Through the Midnight Cry message, we identified two previous battles. We could call it Ipsus, Heraclea, and then it calls this Asculum and Beneventum. Ipsus, Heraclea, Asculum, Beneventum. These two are through Daniel 11. These four are through the lines of Pyrrhus. So we can now identify four battles. Four battles between the King of the North and the King of the South in our history. And we started to teach through understanding Ipsus, and then late last year understanding Heraclea, the nature of these battles and the way that they are now fought. And what is the methodology of today's warfare? Information warfare. Information warfare externally, so what do you expect to see our issue internally? Information war. There's an information war externally, so this movement itself internally has been through an information war. We can do some compare and contrasts there. But we now identified that we have these four battles in our history. So I just want to take a sidestep for a moment and discuss one point that I think becomes relevant as we try and understand this year in greater detail. This resurrection of the King of the South, who's leading that? Who's leading, who resurrected the King of the South? So we have Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin caused the resurrection of the King of the South, has been re-establishing it as a global superpower. Is Vladimir Putin a dictator or a type of dictator? then the question that I think is relevant for us to consider is, when did he become a dictator? What makes him a dictator? Because this is another issue that we can face when we're looking at battles in ancient history and we make application and we try and understand what war looks like in our time. What does dictatorship look like in our time? So we could go through the history of Vladimir Putin. We know that he lived through 1989, seeing that personally inside Eastern Germany. We understand he went into government, that he holds a lot of bitterness because of what he witnessed as the Soviet Union fell. He has a score to settle with the West. He became involved in local politics in the history of 1990 to 1995. In 1996, he moves from local politics to a position in Moscow in the state government, and he begins to work, first rising up through the levels of government and then working for the FSB, the successor of the old KGB. In 1999, he's first made a prime minister to Boris Yeltsin, and then when Boris Yeltsin resigns, Vladimir Putin becomes president. So he becomes president in 1999. In 1999, does Putin already have the mindset of a dictator? Would you call him a dictator then? How did he become president? There was a bombing in Russia in some apartment buildings, and there is strong evidence that he, or the FSB behind him, had that orchestrated. He became a national hero overnight, and he used that popularity wave to establish something you could call a cult of personality. So by the time he comes into the office of president, he's already coming in with quite a lot of swagger. He's already begun establishing a cult of personality. These apartment bombings in Moscow that he is widely reported to have orchestrated himself began to be investigated by a number of journalists. There was one particularly, Anna Politkovskaya. She was a Russian journalist. She began to investigate these apartment bombings. She was arrested and put through a mock execution. She was poisoned in 2004 but survived. There was numerous attempts to kill her. On the 7th of October, which happens to be Vladimir Putin's birthday, she was found dead in a lift in central Moscow, just down the road from the Kremlin. She'd been shot in the style of an execution. So she is just the first. A lawyer who had been helping her investigate that apartment bombing died in January of 2009. A journalist came to his aid. She was also killed. One of the informants and colleagues who reported and gave information to Anna was killed in July of 2009. An operative who spoke publicly about Vladimir Putin's rise to power and how it was orchestrated illegally. He fled Russia in 2000. In November of 2006, this is Alexander Litvinenko. He was poisoned and died from polonium poisoning. So these are just a few, just a drop in the bucket of the people that Putin has had to silence over the years, and all of these deaths relate particularly to how he actually became president in the first place. So even at the very beginning, you see his rise to president was orchestrated. It was done illegally, and already through that illegal practice with the purpose of establishing a cult of personality. December 31st of 1999, he becomes president. Through these years, 2000 to 2003, he takes control of the Russian oligarchs. These are the billionaires who made their money as the Soviet Union dissolved and turned to a capitalist West. They made the right investments. They bought very cheaply large parts of Russian infrastructure, and they became billionaires very quickly. It was a bloodbath. Those who didn't get to win in that attempt to take over those Russian whether it was the gas or all the different industries, those who failed to take them were often killed. So these Russian oligarchs had made their billions out of the fall of the Soviet Union. They became very powerful. The first thing Vladimir Putin did when he became president was to take control of them, where he took the very richest of the oligarchs and set him up in a mock trial on live camera and sent a message to every Russian oligarch. And since then, they answer to him, and if they rebel against him, they're usually found dead, and it's usually in London. So he took control of the Russian oligarchs. In this same history, he took complete control over Russian media. And then over the Russian mafia. So which one of these would you mark him a dictator? Media? All? He's still elected by the people. Mind you, he was democratically elected in 2000. He didn't have to fake that election. They voted him in. In 2004, there's a terrorist attack. This is Chechnyan terrorists. This was an awful, not just terrorist attack, but response by the Russian government, where they sent in, there was a school hostage situation, and the government, under Vladimir Putin's orders, sent in grenade launchers, rockets, tanks, and just shelled the school, and over 300 people died, at least 150 of them being children. So this was an awful terrorist attack and response by the government. And here you see Vladimir Putin begin to blame the United States for all their problems. The war in Iraq has begun, so he's already turning anti-West in a more and more strong fashion. So he's angry in 2004 by the Iraq war, on top of everything that's happened before, and he starts to blame America for empowering the Chechnyan terrorists, saying that they were just a weapon of the West. And he's used that same type of reasoning with most of his enemies, including political protests at home. So when this terrorist attack happens, he uses it as an excuse to, first of all, cancel elections throughout Russia and begin forcing out any political opposition. So due to these terrorist attacks, he convinces enough of the people that the only way to keep them safe was by strengthening the power of his own government. He takes over all the local Russian elections and changes them from being democratically elected officials elected by the people to being placed officials placed through the order of his own political party. So he takes over local governments. If you were to ask an external source when Vladimir Putin really showed himself as a dictator, they would give you this event. You know that he doesn't face political opposition in his own country today. No other political party can go against him. They either die or they're arrested or they're just too scared. That began in 2004. It's here that he took a vice-like grip on the Russian government. So many secular sources would mark 2004 as the establishment of his dictatorship, and yet 2008 he resigns. he doesn't resign. His term ends and he won't run again. So he steps down from power for a 4-year term. So you have someone that we're calling a dictator that was elected by the people twice and then steps down when his term ends and then is elected again in 2011. So he's elected again, 2011. Elected by the people. How can he be a dictator? 2011 forward, and you can mark different waymarks in this history, 2014 being one of them, but it's really even extended to this year. He's taken complete control over the Russian internet. He took over the Russian media, the television networks and radios, but the internet had largely remained free. It isn't until he's back with his third term that he starts taking control of the internet. And he does that over a period of years. This again is excused by, his excuse for doing this is because of the political protests erupting in 2011 against his government. In 2014, he begins using the Internet Research Agency, an information warfare machine, and also invades the Ukraine. And we've seen his behaviour escalate since 2014. Particularly. But the question is, why do we call him a dictator? And at what waymark do you want to mark him a dictator? What did he specifically do? Do you want to mark when he took over the media, as some said? Or do you want to mark when he took over local government? Or when he took control over the internet? It depends on your story where you want to mark him as a dictator. Everyone knows that he is one. But the problem is that he's elected by the Russian people, and many of them, despite the protests, are happy with the work he does, and they don't want him removed. He has the support of his people. He has the support of his own political party. And he has the support of vast areas of the Russian population. Not just of the Russian population, but you actually find him in pockets throughout the world. He's extremely popular. Particularly, interestingly enough, even in conservative America, they like Vladimir Putin, which is why they had no problems with his close relationship with Donald Trump. They see Vladimir Putin who is a strong leader who defends the West, defends Europe against immigration, defends Christianity from gay marriage and all those different immoral things. They see him as a strong moral leader. And that is why they had no problem with seeing Donald Trump work closely with him. They wanted their own Vladimir Putin. Millions of his own people would vigorously protest us calling him a dictator. Millions of his own people don't even believe they have a dictator. So how do we justify calling him one? What I think we need to do is learn from our mistakes when it comes to literal and symbolic. When we see a war 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, let's say Ipsus, when we see the Battle of Ipsus and we see a hot war, that we don't take that to 2016 and expect a hot war. Was it a battle? Yes. It was a battle. Is there a winner and a loser? Yes. So it is a battle, but what it looks like is different. So when we talk about dictatorships, when we go back into history and we see Napoleon, he stood up in 1799, 220 years ago from November 9 this year, and he just said, "I'm a dictator." Donald Trump is never going to do that, and yet we are marking Donald Trump as a dictator. So we have to consider what a dictator looks like. One of the ways we can consider what a dictator in the United States will look like is to consider what dictators look like in our time, and Vladimir Putin is a prime example. What can we learn about a dictator? What is the progression here? Vladimir Putin, he's establishing himself as a dictator. It's progressive. I think I heard a brother mention progression, but it doesn't stop us being able to mark waymarks in this time. 2004 is a waymark where you could say Russia now has a dictatorship. Just as you would say 2019, the United States has a dictatorship. You can mark waymarks, but the whole process is progressive. But there's something else that I want us to see, and we're marking it down here. If we just looked at this history, actually I'll do one below. 2019. Vladimir Putin in 2019, has he had a good year? It's been victory on a global scale, all the way from Venezuela at the beginning of the year, down through December with China. This whole of the year has been victory, one after another, for Vladimir Putin, all across the world. But to get to this point, what did he have to do? First of all, he had to become president, and then 2000 to 2003, what was the process? What I want us to see is a similar principle to what we teach within our own reform line. If we were to look at the reform line of the 144,000, as Ellen White sees it, she's going to talk about the second advent. She'll talk about the close of probation, and she will talk about the Sunday law, and the loud cry. This is what Ellen White gives us. Sunday law, loud cry, close of probation, second advent. We've understood and we've added to that 1989. It's 9/11. Why is this Ellen White's focus? Why does she give us this? Because she's focusing on the world. This is all the work being done for the world. And what do we need to understand? The work for the church. So this history, 1989 to the Sunday law, is the work for the church. Because what does God have to do first before he does a work for the world? He has to straighten out his own people, straighten out his own church, bring them into line before he can do a work for the world. This is God's church. What about Satan's church? We do the line of the counterfeit, and we particularly take it from 2001. And we see this first history, one that we're still grappling with and unfolding today. It has more that it must open up. But this is God's church. This is Satan's church. And as we do the line of the counterfeit, whether it's Alpha history prior to World War II, or this history in its Omega history under Francis, what is Francis having to do? Take control of his church. This is why they're in civil war. This is why they're talking about a Catholic schism. This splits God's church. This is splitting Satan's church. They're in two camps. The Benedict side of the conservatives, who look to conservative right-wing people such as Steve Bannon, such as Pope Benedict before he resigned, and those liberal forces who look to Pope Francis. And they're in a state of civil war. So Satan must first cleanse and sort out his own church before he plans on using them to do a work with the world. Can we see that? So when it comes to a dictatorship, what do you notice about what Vladimir Putin first had to do? He wants to do a work with the world. He wants to re-establish Russia as a superpower. He's going to do that in the history of 2014 to 2019, in this dispensation primarily. And he begins it with Ukraine. Then he goes into Syria. He starts propping up Syria and Venezuela and proxy wars in Yemen and Libya and across the world. He's doing a global work here, but before he did the work for the world, what did he first have to do? He had to first deal with his own country. Not just his own country, but his own political party. 2 steps. This is 2 steps, is it not?
Yes.
First the church, then the world, but it's in 2 steps. We can mark the harvest of the priests from 2019 to 2021, then the harvest of the Levites. Priests and Levites. So as Vladimir Putin does his work, you have it in 2 steps. First of all, he has to take control of his own political party. He does that in these early years. From the time he's established as president, what does he begin to do? What does every dictator begin to do? Stalin did it, Hitler did it. They begin to purge. Purge their own government of every single dissenting voice. They purge their own political party, and then once they've got their own political party composed entirely of loyalists, then they take over their country and any other dissenting political party. So first they purge their own party until they have a unified, strong party that would not dare say a word against them, and then they must do a work over every other political party. So in the history of 2004, taking over from local governments, starting to silence any other political party that is a threat to United Russia, his political party. When he does this to the country, he also begins to take over the internet, and then from 2014 to 19, it's the world. Then he can start doing a work. There's no point doing a work for the world where he does not have a dictatorial grip on his own country. First the church and then the world. First Russia and then all the other countries. First the church in 2 steps. First his own country in 2 steps. His own political party, those who he expects to back him, and then every other political party and local government. So I would suggest that he has been a dictator since 1999. He was a dictator at the very start, and all it has been is a process of establishing himself. So when we come to Donald Trump in 2016, he's elected president, yes? He's elected president in 2016. Prophecy already marks him as a dictator. People can't see it unless they want to see it. If you follow the right stream of information and you follow his rhetoric, he's already talking like a dictator. He has all the lingo of a dictator. He's saying through the 2016 election, if I lose this election, I may not accept defeat. I might just proclaim myself president anyway. He's calling on his party to be entirely loyal to him. He's calling on foreign governments to help him. He's criticizing every other media organisation that does not support him. He also has some links to the American version of the mafia too, but I won't go too far into what can turn into conspiracy theories. He did have a business associate with close links to the mafia. But you can see the same steps. What must be Donald Trump's first work to establish a dictatorship? And what party is that? The Republican Party. So first he's going to purge the Republican Party. From the time in we go back to 2015, he's running for office, and how many Republican congressmen, members of government are supporting him? Not very many. You have some that are already speaking against him. They're saying that he has no experience in government, that he has no moral compass. They are... I would just mention one. If you looked up the name Lindsey Graham, I'm not sure if I'm spelling that correctly. Maybe an A. If you looked up Lindsey Graham and saw what he was saying about Donald Trump in 2015, he said he's not fit for president, he has no moral compass, he has no experience in government. Many Republicans are opposing him. And then from 2016 to 2019, what has Donald Trump done? First, he became president, and then he began to purge. And from 2016 to 2019, what do you see happen to every Republican official who opposes him? They either quit or they are fired. They resign or they are fired. If they can be fired, they're fired. If they can't be fired, they already know that to speak against Donald Trump is to kill your political career. So many of them, something like 40%, have quit in the history of 16 to 19. The Republican government officials who are speaking against Donald Trump at the moment have already ended their political career in the last couple of years and resigned because they know that they have no future in government now. So from 16 to 19, he completely purges his party. If you were to go back to the history of Hitler, how did Hitler purge his political party? He took power in 1933. 1933, Hitler takes power, and then it's known as the Night of the Long Knives. On the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler sent out assassins that killed vast members of his own political party, the people that had got him elected. His own political party who supported him. One of those men that he had killed was dying on the ground, knowing that he had just been stabbed on Hitler's orders, and he's still saying, "Hail Hitler." That was the extent of some of their loyalty to Hitler. But because they were a threat, he had them killed. And if they weren't supporting him, they were also killed. They were all purged from his government. He had to do that internal purge of his own government before he could take over the country as a dictator, or before he could then begin World War II. Extend that, start taking other countries. So when we look at what Donald Trump has been doing from 16 to 19, in the history of 15 and 16, Lindsey Graham has no kind words to say about Donald Trump. What does he say about Donald Trump now? He's completely bent the knee. He's kissed the ring. He would do anything Donald Trump told him to do. And people externally are learning a lot by doing a compare and contrast between Lindsey Graham in 2016 and Lindsey Graham this year. He has completely surrendered to Donald Trump. So 2019 was an impeachment process that led to a vote on impeachment. How many Republicans voted to have Donald Trump impeached? Zero, not one. That's the first It's only the third impeachment in US history. If Nixon had have been impeached, we could add him and say the same thing, but that is the first impeachment in US history where they are completely supported, 100% supported by their own political party. It's never happened before. And it's never happened before because they've never had a dictator who's begun the work by taking over his own party. We can identify this year, 2019, as being the year where he's completed that. He has a vice-like grip on the Republican Party. Everyone not in accordance with him has, over the last 3 years, they have been fired or they have resigned. And we know next he will take a grip on the country, all before he can extend that from Palm Sunday law forward. So what I wanted us to consider was, what does a dictatorship look like? And we can, just like we can look at war and we look at the history of Pyrrhus or Raphia and Panium, and we bring that to our own time, and we can expect to see this hot war between the king of the north and the king of the south, and then we understand that it's not a hot war, it's an information war. And it's the same with a dictatorship, that Napoleon said, I'm a dictator. He was just, in his history, it was fine to just state it as a fact, but in our time, it cannot look as obvious. And that is why, even Elder Jeff, he said recently, something that I don't think I will ever understand. And I want to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he just worded himself badly. But he said that I failed in my prediction because I said that Donald Trump would become a dictator this year, and he isn't. So there's a problem with his application of prophecy. If you can't see Donald Trump as a dictator this year, you certainly can't see Vladimir Putin as a dictator. Our problem is understanding what dictatorship looks like. It's understanding literal and spiritual application, which is all about understanding parables. Vladimir Putin, he didn't look like the dictator of Stalin straight off. Instead, you purge your own party, which is what Stalin did. Then you take a vice-like grip on the country, which is what Stalin did. And then you start extending to all the other countries, extending your reach, which is what Stalin did. And Hitler. The difference in our time, when we come to the United States and we see Donald Trump go through this own process, this 3-year purge of his own political, I'm going to say 3 years because it's Donald Trump. But I just want to note that purging of the Republican Party began in 2014. It was the work of 3 men: Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, Jeff Sessions. Again, it encompasses our dispensation. They began to purge the political party, the Republican Party, in 2014 because Steve Bannon, leading these 2 men, and I don't mean to be misunderstood. I think Stephen Miller should get much more attention than he does. The other 2 get the attention. It's Stephen Miller we should be watching. But led by Steve Bannon, they understood that the first thing they had to do was to establish the America they wanted. The far-right, Christian-led America was to first change the Republican Party from the inside, then take government. So this work of overturning the Republican Party began in 2014. I'm marking 16 because this is when it happens under President Trump. But when he goes through this process, he's purging people, his own party. How does he purge them? It's not with guns and knives as Hitler and Stalin used. How does he purge them? Sorry?
In the ballot.
In the ballot? And how does he get them out in the ballot?
He's taking control of the voting base.
The voting base? How does he take control of the voting base? Information. It's his Twitter feed. It's how he uses Fox News. It's an information purge. He's been able to use information exact same way to cause the exact same result as Hitler was able to use a sword or Stalin a gun. They established themselves as a dictator by purging their own parties through bloodshed. We are in an information war externally. It's an information war whether or not it's on the Eastern Front with the King of the North and the King of the South, or the Western Front, internal to the West, within even the United States itself. Both of these, Eastern Front and a Western Front, is an information war. So if Donald Trump wants to take control of the West, of his own country, he's going to use information weapons, because we're in the information age. It's an information-based reform line from 1989, the World Wide Web. So just using his Twitter feed, and if you watch how Donald Trump treats his own Republican politicians who so much as voice the slightest hint of discrepancy with him, if they so much as hint as being opposed to him on any level, in any way, however minor, however insignificant, he launches a Twitter attack that terrifies them. They are afraid of the way he can use information. And when he does that, the millions of people that form his voting base in the United States believe every word he says. And that person who opposed him in the smallest, most minute way, their political career has just died. Politically, they're dead, they've been purged. Which is why you come to an impeachment and there is no one left. They've either been purged or they have bent the knee. So using information, he has been able to go through the exact same process over this last 3-year time period. So I have no problem in 2019 calling Donald Trump a dictator. Vladimir Putin was a dictator from the time that he was elected president, but it happens in steps. It's progressive. We have a line of battles. (2016). I'll skip 2018, we'll go to Raffia. Panium. And the Sunday Law. We have different lines that say that Donald Trump is a dictator here. Some say he's a dictator here. Others say that he's a dictator here. And finally, he's a dictator here. And why would you mark a dictatorship at Sunday Law? Sorry? Yes, he would. I would suggest he's here. Now he can do it for the world. Because from Sunday Law forward, you know that he's going to extend that dictatorial power for the world. And how do we know that it's here? What do we mark at the Sunday Law? So what's happened to the other one? It's dead. What died? The Republic. So the Republican horn is broken here. If Republicanism is broken here, what's just happened? The Constitution, you can mark a dictatorship, because what has he just done? If he's broken republicanism, he's taken full control of the country, has he not? Once you break republicanism, all that is left is dictatorship, because once he breaks that Republican horn, he has a dictatorial, vice-like grip now on the country. First he has it over his own political party. Then he must get that dictatorial grip over the whole of the country, and then when he has that, the Republican horn being broken, then he can extend that dictatorial control over the world. So again, we're marking that progression. He's a dictator as soon as he's elected, as is Vladimir Putin. Depending on the history or the line that we're taking. But when we take all of those histories and condense them together, what they give us is a clear line of progression. He was as soon as he's elected, then he's going to purge, then he's a dictator in 2019. The purge is complete, and we see that particularly with the vote at the impeachment hearings. Then we see that from 2019 to 2021, here he's marked as a dictator. The King of the South is defeated, that restraint is removed, and then finally at the Sunday Law, he finally manages to break that Republican horn. So we looked at these 4 battles. These 4 battles are all about the Eastern Front of World War II, Hitler versus Stalin, East versus West. These 4 battles, Ipsus, Heraclea, Asculum and Beneventum, or if we're talking about Daniel 11, Raphia, Panium, this is all the Eastern Front. And when you consider the Eastern Front, it's an information war. We should have expected this. There was no battle in 1798. There was no battle in 1989. In fact, in 1989, you don't even see, you have no visibility on the United States being involved in the fall of the Berlin Wall, unless you want to extend out to other dates, other years, and see the whole work of American interference. But at the fall of the Berlin Wall, you certainly don't see them. There is certainly no battle. There is no battle here either. So when we come to our history in 2016, there's no open hot battle. But we know it's an information war and there's a winner and a loser, and the results are just as real. When we say literal and spiritual, it doesn't mean the spiritual doesn't exist. Donald Trump is a dictator. There is a winner and a loser. There is a dictatorship. All of these things are real events. It's what they look like that changes. So this was an information war, 2016. 2018 was an information war. And what we have seen through Raphia is also an information war. I just want to read from one news article. Regarding what America is now currently doing. This is from the Washington Post. It says, military cyber officials are developing information warfare tactics that could be deployed against senior Russian officials and oligarchs if Moscow tries to interfere in the 2020 US elections through hacking election systems or sowing widespread discord, according to current and former US officials. One option being explored by US Cyber Command would target senior leadership and Russian elites, though probably not Vladimir Putin himself, which would be considered too provocative. This is quoting Bobby Chesney, a law professor at the University of Texas. When the Russians put implants into an electrical grid, it means they're making a credible showing that they have the ability to hurt you if things escalate. What may be contemplated here is an individualized version of that, not unlike individually targeted economic sanctions. It's sending credible signals to key decision makers within Russia that they are vulnerable if they take certain adversarial actions. The military has long used psychological operations, information war, dropping hundreds of thousands of leaflets in Iraq, for instance, to persuade Iraqi soldiers to surrender to the US-led coalition during the Gulf War. That's the history of 1989 to 91. But the internet, social media and smartphones have vastly extended the reach and precision of such tactics, the reach and precision of information warfare. The development comes as numerous agencies within the Trump administration seek to ensure that the United States is shielded against foreign efforts to disrupt the 2020 elections. The intelligence community last month issued a classified update, a national intelligence estimate asserting that Russia's main goal in the 2020 campaign continues to be to sow discord, to exacerbate fault lines in American society. In the past year, 2018, it's going to take you back to September and October of 2018, the Battle of Heraclea. That's already been discussed as an information war that took place over those 2 years. In the past year, Congress and the Trump administration have eased restraints on the American military's use of cyber operations to thwart foreign enemies. The push is part of a move by military officials, such as Paul Nakasone, who heads both Cybercom and the NSA, the government's powerful electronic surveillance arm, to weave cyber offensive capabilities into military operations. The 10-year-old command's foray into influence operations reflects an evolution in thinking. It's a really big deal because we have not done a good job in the past of integrating traditional information warfare with cyber operations, Chesney said. But as Russia has demonstrated, these two are increasingly inseparable in practice. While other military organizations such as Joint Special Operations Command also have cyber information war capabilities, Cybercom is the first to turn such powers towards combating election interference. The options being considered build on an operation Cybercom undertook last fall in the run-up to the midterm elections. We spoke about the midterm elections in connection with the Battle of Heraclea, and we linked it to that. Beginning in October of 2018, Cybercom used emails, pop-ups and texts to target Russian internet trolls who were seeding disinformation on US social media platforms. This was the information Battle of Heraclea. The trolls worked for the IRA, Internet Research Agency, a private entity controlled by a Russian oligarch close to Putin. Controlled by a Russian oligarch because they will do every bidding that Vladimir Putin tells them to do. Cybercom also messaged hackers working for Russian military intelligence, indicating that their identities were known and could be published. Although the command did not sign its messages, the Americans knew there would be no mistaking who had sent them. When the trolls persisted, Cybercom, beginning on election day and for at least 2 days afterwards, knocked the Internet Research Agency offline. The Americans also sent messages aimed at spreading confusion and discord among Russian operatives, including computer system administrators. Some workers were so perturbed that they launched an internal investigation to root out what they thought were insiders leaking personal information to the US. The new options contemplate targeting key leaders in the security services and the military and potentially oligarchs. The messaging would be accompanied by a limited cyber operation that demonstrates the Americans' access to a particular system or account and the capability to inflict a cost. The options did not envision any attempt to influence Russian society at large in the way that Vladimir Putin uses disinformation, sows disinformation in America, and the reason that they cannot sow disinformation so easily within Russia is because of the vice-like grip that Vladimir Putin has on the internet and the media. Another possibility involves disinformation aimed at exploiting rivalries within the Russian government and power elites. In 2016, the National Security Council, aides in the Obama administration, developed cyber options against Russia similar to those being contemplated by Cybercom now, but no one had an appetite for it. There is a night and day difference between 2016 and this, said a second former US official, who said that Cybercom's thinking several years ago was much more limited and conventional. What we've seen in the last few years is an escalation in America's willingness and ability to engage in information war. Because they've lost 3 battles now. Cyber Command got a boost in August of 2016 when Congress clarified that cyber actions that fall below the use of force it's called the grey zone, can be conducted as traditional military activities as distinct from covert action. All that means is they do not need the same amount of oversight now to conduct something that would be considered information warfare. The government is much more free within the United States to quickly and strongly use information warfare tactics. Also enhancing cybercom's flexibility was Trump's signing in September of 2018, again we trace that all through the history of Heraclea, of a national security presidential memorandum that revised the process by which cyber operations are vetted and approved. No single office within the Defense Department oversees cyber, electronic warfare, and psychological operations. So this month, Congress created a Senate-confirmed position of Principal Information Operations Advisor to coordinate strategy and policy in this area across the Pentagon and with other agencies. So prior to this, to conduct information war, every different agency can do little bits. But what they've done this month is centralize it. So it has one person who has oversight over information warfare tactics throughout the US Defense Forces. The United States already experimented with these tactics. In 2014, it released satellite images and other sensitive intelligence that showed Moscow had trained and equipped pro-Russian rebels in Ukraine. Basically, says Sean McFate, a foreign policy expert and author of The New Rules of War, it's a war of strategic narrative. We need to get into that domain. So this man wrote a book called The New Rules of War, and he's talking about the use of information, cyber, and strategy as being the new plane of warfare today. So we're out of time, and I will just summarize. We did our compare and contrast, and it took us to identifying that the King of the South would resurrect in our time. We've already understood that through Daniel 11. Now we are understanding that also through just the basic structure itself. We understood that the King of the South resurrected. We understand that happens under Vladimir Putin. Then we asked when it happened under Vladimir Putin. So we gave his history, not all of it, but some key events, and perhaps there's others that I've missed. But we marked his beginning as president, how he'd already begun to establish a cult of personality before he became president, how he took over the Russian oligarchs, the media, the mafia. Then in 2004, local governments and started to squash opposition parties. 11 to 19, the Russian internet. Particularly marking 2014, he begins this work, first in the Ukraine and beginning to create the Internet Research Agency, which conducts information warfare all across the world, particularly involved in the 2016 American election. So he begins his work on the world in 2014, and he sees that come to total victory in 2019. He's had victories this year all across the world, and we'll discuss that another time. So if this is what a dictator looks like in our time, we can see it's first of all progressive, and that progression can be marked in 3 steps. First, his own political party, then extending control over the country, other political parties, local governments, and then finally, when he has control of his country, over the world itself. If this is the model of Vladimir Putin, it's in 3 steps, and we understand that these 3 steps are a repeating structure that we identify God uses in his church. Twice the church, then the world. Satan's church, his church, then the world. And if we investigate, we may see the 2 groups here. But we see priests, Levites, or first, second, and third. And then we see within the glorious land, or the King of the South, that first their own country in 2 steps, and then the world. When it comes to doing this work of purging the political party, they're using the same tactics. Donald Trump is using the same tactics on the Western Front as they have used on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front being their battles with Russia. This was information war. This is information war. So Donald Trump, to establish himself as a dictator, is using information war, whether that's his Twitter feed or Fox News, primarily those two. And by doing that, he has been able to do the exact same work that Hitler did with weapons and bloodshed, and that is to purge his political party, his own political party, of all dissenting voices from 16 to 19. And we see the evidence for that, the full evidence for that, with the impeachment hearing and their complete loyalty to him. We went back to discussing information war. Information throughout Ipsis Heraclea Asculum. And now, from the passages we just read, how the United States is beginning, just this year, just at Raphia, beginning to extend their own capabilities of information warfare, which will lead us to Panium and their victory over the King of the South. So information war internally, information war within the West, and information war between the West and the East. On every level, it's a war of information, and it's conducted through the spreading of discord and disinformation. So when we apply this to our own movement, what have we been facing? The same thing. And what we see our enemies doing, those who have left, those who have, like Judas, not understood how to use parables, what they do, how they operate, is not by building lines or structures, but it's through those same tactics. Disinformation. I'm reticent to say straight lies, because sometimes I don't think they mean to. They actually have to invent what we teach to attack it, because they no longer know what we teach. Some of those elements also as lies. Personal attacks, the characteristic of Donald Trump. Information warfare, the silencing of all dissenting voices. It's what we have seen targeted against this movement as well. So on every level, it's an information war, and the only way to know that Vladimir Putin is a dictator is if you follow the right stream of information. If you follow his own media voice, his own channel of information, you can never identify him as a dictator. Instead, he's some type of hero. If you follow Fox News, you would never be able to identify a dictator, either at 16 or 19, or at the Sunday Law. They won't be calling him a dictator at the Sunday Law. The only way to truly identify what is happening with Vladimir Putin is to follow the right sources of information. They won't all call him a dictator. The only way to understand Donald Trump in the United States is to follow the right source of information. So internally to this movement, the only way to follow correctly the history that we're walking through as a movement is to follow the right stream of information. And that core concept is what separated this movement into wise and foolish. It is an understanding of two streams of information. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Sorry? Sorry? Yes. I can write that on the board, and then if someone has it to share, to copy and paste and share. It's called US Cybercom. I'll write it. Cybercom is the agency that was involved in what we call Heraclea, the 2018 crisis. It's what they have been developing through this time. US Cybercom contemplates information warfare. To counter Russian interference. In the 2020 election. And that's a Washington Post article, if someone has it, that they could share with others that may not have access. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, Thank you for your faithfulness to us. We know that we're living in some very significant times, and many people are confused. People are confused internally to this movement to know which side is right, this movement or those who have left. They are confused and they are unsure. I pray that you will give them clarity and understanding, not based on personal attacks, not based on any type of dislike of our former brethren, but based on the structures that you have been giving to us over these prior years. May they have a firm place to set their feet, a firm foundation. I pray for those people. I know others who are personally struggling with the tactics being used right now, the pain it has caused, the difficulties. I pray that they will be encouraged by seeing the prophetic application of these things. Lord, we know externally many people are confused there. As priests, Lord, you are training us to do a specific work. I pray, Lord, that you will bring this in each of our lives to completion, that we may be able to do that work for you, that we can give all those who are willing a clarity and understanding of these external events and what they teach us about you. I put all these things into your hands and pray in Jesus' name. Amen.